Okay, welcome back to this Buddhism A-level video on Karen Armstrong's anthology piece, Life of the Buddha. And this is chapter 3, section 11. So we'll read again and then we'll crack on with taking this apart. But when the Buddha reflected upon these truths, he was not doing so in an ordinary discursive manner. He brought the techniques of yoga to bear upon them, so that they became more vivid and immediate than any conclusion arrived at by normal ratiocination. Every day, after he had collected enough alms for his daily meal, which he usually took before noon, Gautama would seek out a secluded spot, sit down in the asana position, and begin the yogic exercises of grata or concentration. He would practice this mindfulness in a yogic context, and as a result his insights gained a new clarity. He could see them directly, enter into them, and learn to observe them without the filter of self-protecting egoism that distorts them. Human beings do not usually want to realize the pervasiveness of pain, but now Gautama was learning with the skill of a trained yogin to see things as they really are. He did not, however, stop at those more negative truths. He also fostered the skillful states with the same intensity. A person, he explained later, could purify his or her mind by cultivating these positive and helpful states while performing the yogic exercises sitting cross-legged, and by means of the respiratory discipline of pranayama, inducing an alternative state of consciousness. Okay, so let's have a look at this. And things we're not going to cover at the beginning, it's worth just noting here because we've discussed them before. The spelling of Gautama, and it's sort of Sanskrit versus Pali, Gautama versus Gautama spelling, and that reflecting a kind of Mahayana bent there, or at least an attempt to balance traditions, perhaps. Reflected upon these truths, what is it? The truth of dukkha, probably the three universal truths: anicca, anatta. He wasn't. And so we're not going. We've mentioned those already, so we'll move on. Tanha, desire, craving. We've mentioned, and Armstrong's mentioned in previous things. The cause of dukkha is the origin of dukkha. The second noble truth is tanha. So let's look at this next bit here. He was not doing so in an ordinary discursive manner. Let's highlight that. Not doing so in an ordinary discursive manner. Perhaps she has in mind here Socratic dialogue, and Socrates would have come a little bit after Buddha, but not long. Socrates thinking of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and of course Socrates and Plato would never have any causal relationship or influence on each other. But in the mind of Karen Armstrong, there is this thing called big history, and that she's thinking these different ways or modes of new revolutionary ways of thinking can crop up in different places. And so the Buddha, like Socrates, is an axial age thinker. Well, maybe you can be critical about that particular problem. Is Armstrong preparing us later on where she really will drive home this idea of big history, which is an approach to history that's quite teleological? There are different theories of history, and teleology is not a popular theory of history. It was a historic one, going back to Aristotle, and particularly within Christianity, that history is his story. If you're a Christian, it's all about a movement, a progressive movement. It's got has become a secularized version of history, the progression to ever better worlds in the Western Enlightenment myth history. It has a limited teleology in terms of getting us to the perfected world of the modern life, and this was brought crashing down with 2 world wars in the bloodiest century in history. So Armstrong's idea of big history is a contested idea. Her implicit linking of Buddha and Socrates as actual age thinkers is a highly contested concept of history. But it might just be this discursive manner refers to some of the people who influenced the Buddha. Remember, he spent time with other revolutionary spiritual thinkers of the day, the Shramana movement, and this would have included the skeptics. This was a group, the skeptics were people who were, like Socrates, questioned everything, especially life after death. Maybe today this represents the influence on Armstrong, whether she realizes it or not, of empiricism, the need to explain everything via evidence. This, in order to get, to justify it. Think all the way back to David Hume in year 13. If you haven't got there yet, we'll talk about the verification principle of the logical positivists. And this is very similar to a group the Buddha might have probably came across, called the materialists, and their view of how to think about things. So it's not clear what she's referring to here, and she could be linked to several things that may or may not be justified. So we read on. He brought the techniques of yoga to bear upon them. He brought techniques of yoga to bear upon them, so they became more vivid and immediate than any conclusion arrived at by normal things. Okay, what techniques of yoga? She's very vague here. Yoga is a massive word. In one study, in terms of yogic practices, I've come across numbers like 1,300. There are 1,300 different yogic practices. You can't just say yoga. She's being very lackadaisical or lazy with her language here. Which particular techniques of yoga? Or is she imposing on the life of the Buddha later developments, particularly vipassana meditation, insight meditation into the so what techniques can Armstrong really hope to avoid controversy in her amalgamate of the varied practices and traditions of Theravada, Mahayana, and even Hinduism? Is she, by just calling it yoga, it's very vague, which practices? I think she's trying to tread a non-controversial line, and perhaps, is she failing to do this? I think she might be. What could we say? Well, religious studies scholars who approach a text in a sort of secular way might suggest the pre-Buddhist Shramana movement, practices that the Buddha learned from the yogins he meditated with. So this might be just sort of the kind of basic yogin practices. But it seems that she's referring, because Armstrong does elsewhere, to Theravada, drawing heavily from Theravada Vipassana technique. Richard Gombrich says there was a development that took place in early Buddhism, resulting in a change of doctrine, which considered the wisdom, the prajna, as direct insight into the truth taught by the Buddha, and which was a faculty required to attain enlightenment. And you actually had to have not just learn his teaching, but have a sort of religious experience of his teaching, and this was a development in early Buddhism. What do you think about this idea of insight meditation? Does it make sense to anyone but Buddhists or pantheists in general? Does it make sense to atheists? People like Stephen Batchelor and Sam Harris describe themselves as secular Buddhists. Can you have insight into your nature as a secular Buddhist? Insight into the, impermanence of life. Anicca, perhaps. Dukkha, the cause of suffering, is desire, perhaps. Anatta, that we're compounded, made of parts. But the deeper insight that there is something that is uncompounded, Nibbana, well, no, you couldn't. So there is huge questions here. Vipassana meditation is insight into the true nature of reality, and it's not clear how far secular Buddhists can do this. The three marks of existence: impermanence, anicca, dukkha or suffering, and the realization of non-self or anatta. And as we said, Thanissaro says that Vipassana is a later development within Theravada, with the idea of, in the Pali Canon, the PC, of just jhana meditation being much more prevalent. So Vipassana is a development, perhaps in response to Mahayana, perhaps for other reasons, that we see in its fully fledged form by the 5th century AD at least, in the Buddha Aghosa's commentaries and philosophical writings. Gombrich explains Vipassana, and the jhanas are intrinsically linked. Jhana meditation is Vipassana meditation, perhaps. And he describes 4 stages of its development that he takes from from putting together bits of the Pali Canon and other Theravada writings, it has to be said, like Buddha Aghosa. So Gombrich is saying the meditator first in the first jhana explores the body and the mind and the connection as one thing, and explores non-duality, discovering 3 characteristics. The first jhana in this first stage consists in seeing and the body and mind are one, and in the presence of certain phenomena that reveal themselves as appearing and as ceasing, as arising and dissolving, that things arise and things dissolve. And the first jhana is to understand that. The second jhana is the practice where even this vision of phenomena appearing and dissolving disappears, and it leads to a sense of joy, pithy. In the third jhana, even joy disappears, and it's replaced with a sense of happiness, sukha, and concentration. And then in the fourth jhana is characterized by pure mindfulness due to, well, equanimity, meaning pure calmness. The practice leads to a direct religious wisdom or knowledge, prajna, of the Four Noble Truths. Think, and this is what sparks the moment of the Buddha's perhaps insight, his meditation. In the fourth jhana, comfort disappears because the dissolution of all phenomena is clearly visible. So comfort, pain, both disappear. The practice shows all phenomena are unstable, transient, disenchanting. The desired freedom will take place. So, but this fourth jhana is, in a way, vipassana. It's hard to see where vipassana starts after the jhanas, and this fourth jhana clearly is vipassana, it seems to me. And Gombrich says that eventually vipassana meditation leads to insight into the impermanence, anicca, of all things, all phenomena, and then therefore a permanent liberation from attachment, as it were. So, what do you think? Is such insight meditation, does it make sense to anybody other than Buddhists? We further can ask, is it appropriate to read back modern English literature, analytical tools into the Buddha's thinking? As we read on here, we'll see that very interesting term. So they became more vivid and immediate than any conclusion he had arrived at by normal ratiocination. What a interesting term, normal ratiocination. What on earth does that mean? Well, this is a term from modern English literature theory that focuses on form rather than content, on perfecting sentence structure, getting it really accurate so that it communicates very, very well. You analyze language to arrive at an exacting, logical form of words that is, persuasive, almost in that Aristotelian rational sense. But was the Buddha doing the analysis of language? Is that not reading back into the Buddha something that is a modern idea? We read on. Every day after he had collected enough alms. Let's pause again. Every day after he had collected enough alms for his daily meal, which he took before noon. There's a huge amount of conjecture here that we just don't know. We just don't know enough about. The alms collection that is certainly a feature of Buddhism. The alms, certainly Theravada Buddhism today. Fascinatingly, it doesn't happen so much in England because you need the fourfold Sangha. It does seem to go back to the Buddha, but we find the alms collection, the alms round, something described perhaps first of all, or in a limited way, if you read the Acts of the Buddha Akari, this sort of 1st, 2nd century Ashvagoda's biography, hagiography of the Buddha. But probably he did go on an alms round, and probably he didn't eat after lunch. But we don't know this. This is a rule that's certainly become a rule in Theravada monastic practice, and it's part of not the 5 precepts but the 10 precepts not to eat after certain times of the day. But did the Buddha do this, or when did he start doing this? These questions need to be asked. We read on. Gautama would seek a secluded spot and sit in the asana posture. A secluded spot and sit down in the asana posture and begin the yonic. Yeah, we'll pause there a second. The yogic exercises of egrata or concentration. So these are pre-Buddhist practices, one-pointed concentration that Guratana, who's one of the named scholars who's going to come up, Henipula Guratana, talks about in his book The Path of Serenity and Insight, an exploration of Buddhist jhanas. And he identifies, and others like Bhikkhu Bodhi do this, identify Ekagata as a Buddhist teaching that is predominantly Theravada. It's one of the 7 universal mental factors within Theravada Abhidhamma teaching. So it's there in the Pali Canon. It's one of the qualities associated with the 2nd jhana, according to the Pali Canon. And it's the antidote to sensory desire within the 5 hindrances. So this practice is very important, this one-pointed concentration. Bhikkhu Bodhi says of this one-pointed concentration, this is the unification of the mind on its object, although this factor comes to prominence in the jhanas, where it functions as a jhana factor. The Abhidhamma teaches that the gem of this capacity for mental unification is present in all types of consciousness, even the most rudimentary. It there functions as the factor which fixes the mind on its object. One-pointedness has non-wandering, non-distraction as its characteristic. Its function is to conglomerate or unite the associated states. So, is this purely a Theravada practice? It does seem so. And again, Armstrong could do with articulating her bias here for Theravada, rather than trying to mash Theravada and Mahayana together. So we read on in the text just shortly, and begin the yogic exercises of ekrata and concentration. He practiced this mindfulness in a yogic context, and as a result his insights gained new clarity. He could see them directly, enter into them, learn to observe them. That all sounds like Theravada, one-pointed vipassana meditation. Enter into them and learn to observe them without the filter of self-protecting egoism that distorts them. Human beings do not usually want to realize the pervasiveness of pain, but now Gautama was learning, with the skill of a trained yogin, to see things as they really are. To see things as they really are. He did not, however, stop at these more negative truths. He was also fostering the skillful states with the same intensity. So, to see things as they really are. Well, this is again sounds Theravada. It's insight into, well, and he doesn't specify it. That's the problem. Theravada would say to see things as they really are is to see the anicca, dukkha, and anatta in the simple classical sense. If you ask Mahayana, to see things as they really are is to realize our dualistic thinking and enter in, that there is no nibbana to get to and that sort of thing. But Armstrong cleverly avoids such controversies. He did not, however, stop at these more negative truths. Well, this is sort of suggesting anicca, anatta, dukkha. He fostered the skillful states with the same intensity. What skillful states? States of, is it the Brahma, great Brahma Vihara? Is it of being in a Theravada sense, loving, compassionate, and so on? Is it the Mahayana skillful upaya state we've debated before? A person explained later could purify his or her mind by cultivating these positive and helpful states. Remember the word kusala, mental states, while performing the yogic exercises sitting cross-legged by means of the respiratory discipline of prana. Okay, this is very specific. And that's a very modern phraseology. The respiratory discipline of pranayama. Well, the definition of pranayama is kind of focusing on your breath, and this is what one of the basic yogic practices that pre-Buddhists and Hindus and other Jains and others and Sikhs and others use, focusing on your breaths. In fact, you find it across mystical traditions of Islam, as in Sufism, and Christianity, as in the Desert Fathers, the breath prayers, counting your breaths, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie Christos, breathe in, breathe out. but that's only one yogic practice. There are many yogic practices. Now, it's claimed this practice helps you focus on whatever it is you're about to do. And then this last phrase to pick up, we want to say a little bit about inducing an altered state of consciousness. Now, we could say lots about this, and it's like chicken and egg. Such supernatural states of insight, modern psychology struggles with, and yet so often as you read modern psychology, psychologists indicate it might just be possible, it might. Is she relying more on Buddhism or modern psychology? Is modern psychology harking back to Buddhist Eastern ideas in any case, as it's been influenced not by atheists, strong atheists like Freud, but by kind of spiritually kind of open people like Carl Jung. Jung was very interested in altered states of consciousness, getting in touch with your spirit guide. He had his own Philemon. Altered states of consciousness has become a popular form of psychology, which has no place perhaps in, if you go to a hospital, they're not going to try and assess how far, put your health isn't defined by how healthy your altered states of consciousness is. But populist psychology today makes much more of this. People claim that through hypnosis, meditation, hallucination, trance, dreamlike states, you can enter these altered states of consciousness. And you read some populist psychology that encourages this. So Jung and his interest in altered states of Eastern consciousness, in which the mind is at rest, but you kind of engage in other ways. And is this just the influence of the East on psychology? Okay, we pause there.